happening in Parliament as MPs are debating that report which found that Boris Johnson deliberately misled Parliament over parties during lockdown. Now, the Commons is expected to approve the report, but the former Prime Minister has asked his supporters not to oppose it if it does come to a vote. We don't know if it will and whether there will be enough opposition to force a vote, but Labour say the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who's not expected to be at the debate, is too weak to stand up to Boris Johnson. Let's hear more of what the Rhondda MP Chris Bryant has had to say. The Labour MP, he stepped aside from chairing the Privileges Committee due to tweets he wrote about Boris Johnson.
I think it is important to note that public opinion on this matter is extremely clear. Most people think Johnson lied. A few of them don't think that that matters very much, but most do. Most think that ministers who lie should be removed and punished. Yep. And being truthful is the one quality they seek above all else in a Member of Parliament.
Georgia Gilholy is a columnist at the independent online magazine Conservative Home. Joins me now. Good evening, Georgia. Thanks for joining us on Radio Wales Drive. This is a very significant discussion this evening because of the fact that the report itself, unprecedented, really.
Absolutely. And I think that from what we've heard today and what we've heard over the past few months, it's obvious that this was always going to be divisive. And there's been lots of talk, especially from people who are more allied still with Boris Johnson, about the character and the behaviour of some of those people on that committee. But actually, earlier today, Harriet Harman, who, of course, she chaired the report, which has come up with some very damning conclusions about Boris Johnson's conduct in the House. She, previous to being given that role, was heavily critical of him in public. And many people have said, well, she should not have been in that position. This is why, of course, Chris Bryant excused himself from taking part in this report for that reason. However, she's revealed to MPs today that actually the government said, we have full confidence in you, despite some of your, I suppose, anti-Boris Johnson comments. So please go ahead and be involved in this investigation. Actually, if you read the report itself, of course it's going to be divisive, but its tone is fairly flat and impartial. And it's providing swathes of evidence that whatever Boris Johnson thought he was doing, he clearly made statements to his fellow MPs that were not truthful about some of these gatherings and some of this lockdown breaking. I think when you just mentioned there about obviously Rishi Sunak not currently being present in the House, and probably he won't be today during this key discussion, I think that whatever his reasons are for not being there, and I think possibly in terms of saving his own face with the fact that he, of course, also had a Partygate fine, I think it just looks weak. And I think at a time when the Conservative Party is already very divided, it's just sort of another nail in the coffin for that image in terms of what the public think.
I mean, it's that I think the former Prime Minister Theresa May touched on in her intervention in the Commons, and she said that it was important that MPs were being seen essentially to hold their own to account. Do you think she has a point around that this is as much about public perception outside of Westminster as it is what goes on in the House?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen for decades, people's faith in politicians has been plummeting. And situations like this, of course, we know we are never going to know the whole story when it comes to any politicians or any prime ministers. Things will always happen behind the scenes that we won't be 100% aware of. That's life, that's politics. But when it comes to this blatant dishonesty and when it comes to breaking the lockdown rules, these rules, there are many allies of Boris Johnson and otherwise who actually say already at this point, okay, let's put this behind us, it's over with, live and let live. These rules intervene into people's lives in such an unprecedented way in Britain. People weren't able to go, to funerals, to weddings, to visit dying relatives, that kind of thing. It's very serious, not just to mention, of course, the impact on the economy, education. And I think that the fact that people in the highest rungs of our politics were hypocrites and are evidence to have been breaking the law in these situations, I think it's horrific for their reputation. I think that Theresa May is right. And also, when it comes to things like the Privileges Committee and these kind of rules, of course, it should be up for MPs to decide who has violated their rules. That is the way the way this committee works.
And there have been some MPs who've spoken out in support of Boris Johnson. And the interesting thing is that he is asking his supporters not to vote against this report, partly because perhaps that would expose how much support he does or doesn't have within the House. Can you understand that course of action?
From Boris Johnson's perspective, I can, even though he's definitely an interesting person to try and put yourself in the shoes of. I think when it comes to telling people to not sort of try and get this to a vote, I think he knows that most MPs are not going to vote in his favour, essentially, and it could be embarrassing what the numbers might be. They might be lower than maybe you'd even expect. And I think that also, this is just me speculating, but if it doesn't go to a vote, which it probably won't, I think could always be that element of something for him to draw out of the bag and say, well, actually, no, the MPs didn't vote on this, so we actually, in the future, he could say, well, we actually don't know what they would have said, and we actually don't know whether they would have approved of these kind of measures against me, and my supporters weren't really given the opportunity to kind of have their voice heard, that kind of thing. That might be maybe a point he could bring up in the future. We know that he, from his statements over the past week or so, he's been very damning of this report, and also he's even, been very damning of some of his former colleagues in the cabinet, especially Rishi Sunak, who has essentially usurped him.
Yeah.
So from his perspective, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, the thought that perhaps Partygate could continue to rumble on, certainly with the invitation we're seeing to the jingle and mingle at Conservative Party headquarters during 2020. So the row is not finished, is it? Georgia, thank you for your thoughts. Georgia Gilholy there from the website Conservative Home. Just to say, you can follow all of this live on the BBC News website and the app. We don't know whether this is going to go to a vote yet, but the BBC does understand